Jonathan, so we welcome people joining us on YouTube for this service. And we have two readings today. The first one is from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me," I cried, "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he'd taken with tongs from the altar. And with it he touched my mouth, and he said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I. Send me." As we prepare to hear the words of the gospel, we're going to sing our anthem, "Speak, O Lord," as we come to you. Our gospel reading today is from Luke chapter 5. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding round him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he'd finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boats to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore. They left everything and they followed him. God is calling us to something new. He's calling me to something new, and he's calling you as a church to something new too. There is a new call upon our lives, mine and yours. And we don't know yet exactly what it is. And so it's important for us to turn to the Bible to see what we should do when God calls us to something that's as yet unclear and uncertain. Now, I did not choose these two readings for today. Astonishingly, they are actually the readings for the lectionary today. And when I saw them, when I started preparing them for this week, I sent a photo to Paula, didn't I, from the Roots material, because it seemed to me astonishing that this should be the topic of the sermon on the day that I was going to talk to you about being called to something new. And yet it's very encouraging, isn't it? Because it shows us that God knows. God knew this was going to happen long ago, and God somehow organized it so these two things work together. So we can trust God to lead us through this situation, and let's look at what we can learn about calling from his word. So first of all, there's a lot of similarity between the two stories. The picture on the left is the one of Isaiah receiving his calling from God, and one on the right is of Peter falling on his knees in front of Jesus after the miraculous catch of fish. So what are the similarities? Well, the first similarity is that both of the stories begin with people who are feeling discouraged. Today we read from Isaiah chapter 6. But if we had just gone back one chapter to the very end of Isaiah chapter 5, it ends like this. If one looks at the land, there is only darkness and distress. Even the sun will be darkened by clouds. So that's the context in which Isaiah has his vision. The enemy is at the gates of Israel. The people of Israel have turned away from God, and Isaiah the prophet is feeling afraid and discouraged. And if we look at the New Testament, we learn that Simon Peter and his fellow fishermen have been fishing through the night without catching anything. Now, last week, Andrew and Anne and I had a conversation about how hard it is to work through the night, and both of them have had jobs where they've had to do this for years on end. And Peter and his friends have been working through the night, but for nothing. They've come home empty-handed, and as well as the exhaustion of having been up all night, they've probably faced the worry of not having any food to feed their families with or to sell in the market to get some food for their families. And so in both these stories, God's call comes to people who feel discouraged and afraid about the future. And so if you and I feel like that this morning, we're in good company, and let's be encouraged. And the second thing to note is this. In both the stories, God's call is heard in the context of an encounter with God. For the prophet Isaiah, this encounter is a striking vision. Isaiah sees God lifted up on a high throne. He sees the hem of his robe filling the temple. He sees these seraphs, these angels, flying round him. And he hears them saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Heaven and earth are full of his glory." That's a really striking encounter with God. For Peter and his friends, the encounter with God is very different. It starts off as just a request from someone in the village whom they know, the local rabbi, to borrow their boat. But once the fish start coming in, once the nets are just on the verge of breaking, once the two boats are just about to sink, That's when Peter realizes whose presence he's in. Just to give you an idea, each of those boats was huge. Galilean fishing boats were about 30 feet long. They were about 8 foot wide and 5 foot deep. So can you imagine the amount of fish it would have taken to fill both those boats to sinking point? And so in both the cases, God's call comes through an encounter with God. And the person realizes in that encounter that God is the one who calls. And in my case also, I am certain that it is God calling me to something new. He's calling us to something new, along different roads maybe, but calling us at the same time. Because you are part of my story, and I am part of your story, and that's never going to change, even after I leave. Because that's what it means to love one another and have walked this path together. And then in both the stories, something really important happens. The person who receives the call realizes that they're not worthy. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 5, Isaiah says, "Woe to me! I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." In the light of the glory of God, Isaiah sees his own sin and his own weakness, and he despairs. And we see Peter reacting in exactly the same way. We see Peter falling on his knees before Jesus and saying, "Get away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." In both cases, the person who receives the call doesn't think that they are capable of doing whatever it is that God is asking them to do. They feel sinful and they feel weak. And they are right. In our own strength, it is completely impossible to answer God's call. Not one of us here is worthy enough or capable enough to fulfill the call that God has placed on our lives. But God doesn't call us to follow him in our own strength. God knows about our sin. God knows about our weakness. And God is the one who forgives us and cleans us and equips us for the task. In the story of Isaiah, one of the seraphs takes that burning coal from the fire, doesn't he, and touches Isaiah's lips. And it's a sign that now he's been made clean. And in the story of Peter, Jesus says to him, "Do not be afraid." The strength and the right to do the task that God calls us to comes from God himself. And so once again, if you, like me, are feeling nervous at what's in front of us, if you're feeling that we're not good enough or strong enough to follow God in a new period for Salem, a new period for Rosa, we are right. On our own, it would be impossible. But as Luke says in chapter 1, nothing is impossible for God. Those whom God calls, God equips to do that which he calls them to do. And so discouragement, and then meeting with God, an encounter with his glory, and then the feeling of not being strong enough or good enough to do the task, and then that word of encouragement from God, do not be afraid. And then the last thing, the person has been called, and now the person is sent to do something specific. In the case of Isaiah, he is sent to say hard things, difficult things to the people of Israel who have turned away from God. But Peter's story is actually perhaps more interesting and more relevant to us. Because if Jesus had said to Peter on that occasion, said, "Peter, I'm calling you to help me challenge the religious authorities. I'm calling you to head up the global church. I'm calling you to be a rock to the church. And at the end of your life, I'm calling you to die a martyr's death. What do you think Peter would have said? I think he would have said, no thanks. And he would have run as fast as he could in the other direction. There was no way that Peter could imagine the person he was going to become through the grace of God. No way at all. There is no way that he could imagine it. And even if he could have imagined it, he wouldn't have understood or accepted it. But Jesus is kind. And in his kindness and his wisdom, he just says something simple to Peter, something that Peter's going to understand. He doesn't use difficult words. He doesn't use theological language. He uses the language of the fisherman so Peter can understand it. He says, don't be afraid. From now on, you're going to be, in the old language, a fisher of men. Yeah? You're going to fish for people. And in the same way, God sends us. He sends you and he sends me out of our security zones. We can't see the future clearly, and thank God for that. But God is sending us out to follow him in new ways. So I said the last thing was the sending out, but that's not quite true. There's one other thing left to do. Everybody who receives a call from God has to decide whether or not they will accept it, whether or not they will say yes. What does Peter do? We're told in verse 11, then they left the boats on the shore, and they left everything and followed him. Leaving everything and following Jesus. This is the only wise thing to do when God calls you. It's the only response that gives fullness of life to us. It's the only response which brings real safety, even though it might feel really scary at the time. The truth is that if we love Jesus, when he calls us to do something, there is really no other option apart from saying yes. I very much doubt whether anybody here will remember this, even though many of you were there at the time, but 10 years ago, when I was inducted here in Salem, I asked the Reverend Mark Owen to preach. And I asked him to preach on the passage from Luke chapter 1, where Mary receives that incredible call, that terrifying call, to be the mother of God. And she says yes. And the reason I chose that passage was because I was feeling terribly nervous about saying yes to Salem, particularly, of course, because of the challenge of the Welsh, but not only that, actually, because I loved my church in Bethel, just as I love you so much, and leaving them was very difficult. But God blessed that yes I said to Salem, and I have been so happy here as your minister. And now once again, I'm hearing God's call to something new. And once again, it's time for me to say yes. But it's also time for you as a church to say yes. And perhaps you're thinking, well, it's all very well for Rosa to say that, but she's got a choice. We haven't got a choice. Well, actually, I think you do. I think you do have a choice. Because you could see this change as something bad and negative. Or you could see it, as Paula explained, as part of God's great plan to bless Salem and our community. And to do even greater things than the things that God has already done here in Salem over the last 10 years. Even greater things, if I may say so, than the things God has done here in the century and a half since people have been worshipping God on this site. Saying yes to God means accepting with all our hearts to be his co-workers on the great adventure of following Jesus to the next part of Salem's adventure. And you have the privilege of being part of that adventure. I don't anymore, though I'll be asking Francis what's going on every time. I have my own adventure to follow now in 6 months' time. But what a privilege it is to be part of God's work. And so some questions for this week. As we look back over the past 10 years, which, and I don't hesitate to use this word, which miracles, which big changes has God done in Salem over the last 10 years, which have helped us to see that God is in our midst? Secondly, and this is a question we really need to think and pray about over the next couple of months, what sort of church is God calling us to be for the next 10 years? And what sort of person or leader can help us become that church? And finally, how can we say yes to God? We're going to sing now a song that is incredibly precious to me. I sang this song at my baptism, at my ordination, at my induction in Salem. It's the song for saying yes to God. I, the Lord of sea and sky, whom shall I send? And the answer is, here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, Lord, if you lead me. I will hold your people in my heart. But they're not just my words, because God is calling all of you to hold the people of Church Village and Tonteg and Llantwit and Batham, Pontyclun and all these other areas in your hearts. And God is saying to you, whom shall I send? And it's a chance for each one of you to say, here I am, Lord, send me. Let's stand together and sing.